I spent 12 years cooking every holiday meal for my family. Then my parents ordered me to feed my brother's 25 guests like a maid, so I flew to Hawaii. That same night, my father announced it over coffee, not even looking up from his phone. "Your brother's friends are coming for Christmas. About 25. He said it the way you'd tell someone the mail had arrived. My brother Grant stood behind him in the kitchen doorway, arms crossed, nodding like a king, approving a decree he'd already signed off on. I asked who was cooking. Walter blinked at me like the question didn't make sense. "Come on, Elena. You've done this 100 times. My mother Ruth was already reaching for the flour canister before her brain caught up to what had just happened. 30 years of reflex, triggered by one sentence. I stood there holding my coffee, watching it go cold, and felt something in my chest go very quiet and very still. I smiled. "Sure, Dad. I'll handle it." Grant gave me a thumbs up and disappeared back downstairs to his Xbox. Nobody asked if I had plans that year. Nobody asked if I had time or money or the will left in me to do this again. 12 years of this exact scene, and I had never once said no. That morning, standing in my parents' kitchen in Millbrook, Ohio, under the same yellowed curtains that had hung there since I was 19, something in me finally broke clean in half. I just didn't let it show on my face yet. I finished my coffee, rinsed the cup, and drove home already knowing, somewhere underneath the smile, that this would be the last time. My name is Elena Voss. I'm 31 years old. I run a small catering business out of a rented commercial kitchen in Dayton with my best friend and business partner, Paige Okafor. We started it 6 years ago with $4,000 between us and a used convection oven we bought off a closing diner. It isn't glamorous. Most months, it barely clears enough to cover both our rents with a little left over for supplies. But it's mine. Every industrial mixer, every roasting pan, every 12-inch carbon steel skillet, every folding banquet table stacked along the back wall of my parents' garage belongs to that business. Belongs to me and Paige on paper with receipts. My parents never bought a single piece of it. They just used it every Thanksgiving, every Easter, every Christmas for over a decade, like it had always been theirs to use. The holiday cooking started when I was 19. My mother had hip surgery that November, and someone had to make Thanksgiving happen. I was the only daughter, the only one in the family who'd shown any interest in cooking, so it fell to me. Naturally, everyone said, "Elena's good at this. Elena doesn't mind." Nobody asked if that second part were actually true. It became permanent the way water becomes ice, slowly and then all at once, until you can't remember it ever being anything else. By the time I turned 25, it wasn't a request anymore. It was baked into the calendar like a law of physics. Every October, my mother would say, "So what are we doing for Thanksgiving?" And it was understood without discussion that we meant me, alone in a kitchen, for 9 hours, while everyone else watched football and drank the wine I'd also bought. Grant is 28, 3 years younger than me, and had lived in my parents' basement since he dropped out of Sinclair Community College at 21. He worked part-time at an auto parts store on Route 4 and described himself, without irony, as being in between opportunities. He had been in between opportunities for 7 years. My parents never once asked him to pay rent. They asked me every single holiday to show up with my equipment, my labor, and my time, and hand all three over for free, year after year, without so much as a thank you card at the end of it. 3 years ago, when Montgomery County sent my parents a notice that they owed $14,000 in back property taxes, I was the one who wired the money the week before the deadline, because the alternative was watching them lose the house. I told myself it was a loan, that Dad's disability appeal would come through eventually and he'd pay me back. The appeal never came through. The subject never came up again either. Not once. Not even as an apology for the delay. 8 months after that, their furnace died in February, in the middle of a cold snap that put 3 people in the local ER for exposure, and I covered the $4,000 replacement because my mother cried on the phone and said they'd freeze if I didn't. 2 years ago, I put $6,000 toward a new roof after Walter mentioned, almost as an afterthought over dinner, that the homeowner's insurance had lapsed 18 months earlier without either of them noticing. Add it all together and it comes to just over $31,000 in cash, wired directly from my business and personal accounts over 3 years. Not one thank you. Not one holiday where anyone said out loud, "We owe you something." Not one moment where anyone in that house paused to ask what I might need in return. There was a specific incident 2 Thanksgivings before all of this that I didn't understand the full weight of until much later, until the notebook, until Hawaii. I was brining a 22-pound turkey in a cooler on the back porch, hands numb from the ice water, when Grant came out to grab a beer from the second fridge we kept out there for holidays. He looked at the spread I was building through the kitchen window, the stuffing already resting in its dish, the candied yams caramelizing on the stove, 3 pies cooling on wire racks, and he said, "You know, you'd make someone a really good wife someday." He wasn't trying to be cruel. That was the worst part of it. He said it like he was commenting on the weather, pleasant and unthinking. I laughed it off because that's what you do. You laugh off the small ones so you don't have to look directly at what they actually mean. But I never forgot that sentence. Not a business owner, not a person with her own ambitions and her own exhausted body. A service fully formed, just waiting to be assigned to whoever needed it next. I carried that sentence around for 2 years before I understood it wasn't a compliment. It was a diagnosis of how this entire family saw me. I want to be clear that this isn't a story about hating my family, because for a long time, I didn't. I loved my mother's laugh, the real one, the one that came out before she learned to swallow follow her opinions to keep the peace. I loved my father before the disability claim and the years of resentment that came after it, back when he used to take me fishing at Cedar Creek on Saturday mornings and let me steer the little aluminum boat even though I was terrible at it. I loved Grant when he was younger, before the basement swallowed whatever ambition he'd once had. But love, in that house, had quietly become a one-way transaction over the course of 12 years, and I was always, without exception, the one paying the balance. The Christmas announcement came on a Sunday, December 14th, 11 days before the holiday. 25 guests. Grant's college friends from a school he'd dropped out of, most of whom I'd never met, plus his girlfriend Sienna Marchetti and her parents Richard and Donna, who were, according to Grant, kind of a big deal in Cincinnati real estate and needed to be properly impressed. My father delivered the request like it had already been settled somewhere above my head, in a meeting I hadn't been invited to. I said yes out loud, the way I always did. Inside, some part of me was already somewhere else entirely, already gone, already sitting on a plane I hadn't booked yet. That night I couldn't sleep. I sat in my car in my parents' driveway for 20 minutes after the house had gone dark, just staring at the porch light, doing math I had never once let myself do before. 12 years, 3 major holidays a year minimum. That was 36 full days of unpaid, unacknowledged labor, not counting the smaller gatherings, not counting the equipment, not counting the $31,000, not counting a lifetime spent being handed the check for a meal I had never actually agreed to prepare in the first place. I went inside my own apartment that night and didn't sleep. Instead, close to midnight, I drove back to my parents' house because I remembered my mother mentioning she wanted the old ceramic ornaments down from the attic, the ones my grandmother Frida had hand-painted decades earlier, and some part of me wanted to hold something that still felt uncomplicated. I let myself in with my spare key and climbed the pull-down ladder into the attic, and that's where I found the tin box. It was rusted at the seams, stamped with my grandmother's initials, F.E., tucked behind a stack of 1970s encyclopedias nobody had opened in 30 years. Inside was a notebook, its cover soft and split with age, the spine barely holding. I sat down cross-legged on the cold plywood and started reading, and by the third page my hands were shaking hard enough that I had to set it down twice. My grandmother had logged every holiday meal she'd ever cooked for this family, starting in 1967 and ending in 2003, the year before she died. Guest counts, full menus, written in careful blue cursive, dollar amounts, tracked down to the cent, pulled from her own modest grocery budget for decades because nobody ever offered to split the cost with her either. Small notes crowded into the margins. Walter didn't arrive until 4. Missed the ham entirely. Asked to host Easter again. No one asked how I felt about it. 36 years of quiet documentation, like she needed proof somewhere that it had happened, even if no one would ever read it. The last entry was dated Christmas Day, 2003. Underneath it, underlined twice in the same blue ink, was a single tally: 187 meals. No one had ever asked how much it cost her. Not in dollars. Not in anything that actually mattered. I sat on that attic floor for a long time, dust thick in my throat, my grandmother's handwriting steady under my fingers, even as her hand had clearly started to shake toward the end of the notebook. I understood something in that moment I had never let myself understand before. 3 generations of women in this family had fed everyone around them, and had never once been asked what they wanted in return. My grandmother had died still keeping that ledger, as if the act of counting mattered even when no one else was watching. I was about to become meal number 188. Sitting there in the cold, I made a decision that felt less like a choice and more like something finally arriving on schedule. I would not become that number. I would not add my name to a list nobody else in this family even knew existed. The next 11 days, I planned with a kind of precision I didn't know I had in me, though the plan itself was simple enough to state in one sentence: stop. I told almost no one. Not Paige, not at first, not my roommate, no one. I kept up the normal routine on the surface, texting Grant a mock menu, asking Sienna's mother about dietary restrictions over a group text, letting everyone believe the machine was running exactly the way it always had, on schedule, without complaint. Underneath that surface, I was quietly and methodically withdrawing every piece of collateral I'd left sitting in that house for 12 years. I called Paige on December 20th, 3 days before I needed her. I need you to do something for me on Christmas Eve, and I need you not to ask too many questions yet. Paige has known me since culinary school in Columbus. She's seen me tired in ways most people never have. She didn't ask many questions at all. She just said, tell me what time, and tell me what to bring the truck for. Quick pause from the story. If you enjoy these stories, consider taking a listen to our Spotify show linked in the description for early access to new stories in better audio quality. Now back to the video. By December 22nd, I had already placed the wholesale grocery order for the Christmas meal: 60 pounds of turkey, a whole spiral ham, 2 full cases of produce, all of it charged to the same store account I'd used every year, under my own name, because I was always the one who placed it, without anyone ever once offering to split the cost. This year, I didn't cancel that order out of spite. I canceled it because it was mine to cancel, purchased with my money on my account, for a meal I had never technically agreed to fund in the first place. I had paid for 11 previous years of Christmas groceries out of my own catering margins. No one had ever reimbursed a cent of it. I logged into the wholesale account on the night of December 23rd and canceled the pickup with 3 clicks. No note attached, no explanation offered, just gone, the way it should have been gone years earlier. Every piece of equipment sitting in that garage, the industrial mixer, the roasting pans, the full carving station, the folding tables, the chafing dishes with their little sterno cans still half used from last year, belonged to me and Paige, purchased under our business license with our business's money. It had been sitting there for years because it was convenient, because it meant not hauling 600 pounds of catering gear back and forth every few months, because some naive part of me had genuinely believed that leaving it there was a form of trust between us. On the night of December 23rd, I sent Paige one text. Garage unlocked. Take everything tonight. She and her cousin Marcus backed a box truck up to that garage at 11 p.m. and cleared it out in 90 minutes flat, working by phone flashlight so they wouldn't wake the house. Every tray, every pan, every last serving spoon, and stack of folding chairs. By midnight, the space that had fed 25 people every single Christmas for over a decade was nothing but a dusty concrete floor and some abandoned paint cans. I wrote one letter. I kept it short and factual on purpose, because long letters invite arguments, and arguments always somehow end with the person setting the boundary apologizing for having one. I left it under the salt shaker on the kitchen table, addressed to my father, because he was the one who'd made the announcement in the first place, and he was the one who needed to be the first to read it. Then I packed one bag. I closed the door of my own apartment without a sound, even though there was no one there to hear it, and I drove 90 minutes to Dayton International, where I'd booked a one-way red-eye to Honolulu 3 days earlier, paid for out of a savings account my family didn't even know I had. The flight left at 1 in the morning on December 24th. I told no one in my family I was leaving the state, let alone the country's time zones, behind entirely. As far as they knew, right up until the moment they discovered otherwise, I was at home that night, prepping, exactly like every other year of my adult life. By the time my mother woke up on the morning of Christmas Eve to start the early prep work, the sausage stuffing that always needed a night's head start, I was already somewhere over Denver with my forehead pressed against a cold airplane window, watching the lights of a country I was quietly leaving behind for 4 days. She would have opened the pantry expecting the wholesale delivery sitting there in its usual boxes. Nothing. She would have walked out to the garage for the roasting pans she needed to start prepping the ham. Empty shelves, swept completely clean, like the scene of a robbery minus any broken glass. And then, somewhere in that sequence of discoveries, she would have found the letter tucked under the salt shaker. I know exactly what it said because I wrote it myself, and I've reread it more times since than I'd like to admit out loud. I have cooked 144 holiday meals for this family over the last 12 years. I found Grandma Frida's notebook in the attic. She cooked 187 and was never once thanked for a single one of them. I will not cook meal 145. The equipment in the garage belonged to my catering business. It has been retrieved. The groceries were on my account and have been canceled. I love you both. I am done being assumed. Merry Christmas. Elena. My father called the grocery store first, then 2 different caterers listed in the county directory, then a delivery service that told him flatly that nothing was available on Christmas Eve morning with less than 18 hours notice. This is rural Ohio. There is no functioning backup plan for a 25-person Christmas dinner conjured out of thin air in half a day. Grant, apparently, was the one who finally drove out and spent $382 of his own money, the first significant money he'd spent on that household in years, on rotisserie chickens and canned cranberry sauce from a gas station 40 minutes away because it was the only place still open and stocked on a holiday morning. My father looked at what came home in those plastic bags and reportedly said, out loud in front of my mother, "That's not Christmas dinner. That's a gas station buffet." I wasn't there to hear it myself. I heard about it later from more than one source independently, because it turns out a house full of embarrassed guests remembers a sentence like that word for word. Christmas morning, 25 guests walked into a house decorated for a feast that no longer existed. Paper plates stood in for the good china. A bed sheet did the work of a tablecloth because the actual linens required ironing skills my mother had never once had to develop herself. Chicken sat sliced unevenly on a bare cutting board on the counter because nobody had thought or known how to plate it properly. Sienna's parents, Richard and Donna Marchetti, arrived in pressed blazers carrying a bottle of wine that cost more than the entire meal in front of them, expecting the feast Grant had apparently been promising them for weeks. Instead, they got lukewarm rotisserie chicken and a bowl of boxed stuffing mix, because that was the only stuffing available at a gas station at 7 in the morning on a holiday. Sienna leaned toward Grant in the doorway and whispered something that at least 3 separate people later repeated back to me, almost word for word, like it had lodged itself in the room's memory. "I thought your sister was cooking." Grant's jaw tightened. "She had an emergency," he said, which was, in its own strange and accidental way, the first honest sentence anyone in that house had said about me in 12 years, even though he clearly meant it as a lie to smooth things over. At 12:15, the doorbell rang, and my Aunt Vivian, my father's older sister, walked in carrying a tin of shortbread cookies she'd made herself the night before. Vivian is 74, sharp as a blade, and has never once in her life pretended to feel something she didn't. She took one look at the paper plates, the empty eggnog pitcher, the unevenly sliced chicken curling at the edges under the kitchen lights, and she said absolutely nothing. She simply walked to the armchair by the front window, sat down with a cup of coffee someone quietly poured her, and watched. She watched my father explain the same lie to cluster after cluster of confused guests, something about a supply chain issue with the caterer, a story that fell apart a little more with each retelling because there had never actually been a caterer to fail him. She watched my brother brother saw unevenly at a rotisserie chicken breast like he had never once held a carving knife in his life, because he genuinely hadn't, because that had always, without discussion, been my job. Vivian waited. She told me afterward that she had been waiting for a room full of witnesses like this for almost 20 years, ever since she'd watched my grandmother collapse from sheer exhaustion in that same kitchen back in 1998, and heard my father, her own younger brother, tell Frida to sit down and let the girls handle the rest, meaning me, 12 years old at the time, already quietly being trained for a role I had never once been asked if I wanted. At 1 in the afternoon, someone's phone buzzed. I hadn't planned this part exactly, but I hadn't hidden it either. I had posted one photo from a beach outside Waikiki that morning, coffee in one hand, the Pacific spread out turquoise and enormous behind me, with a single line underneath it. First holiday in 12 years I didn't spend cooking in someone else's kitchen. It was Sienna's phone that lit up first, tagged by an old catering client of mine who happened to know her through a mutual friend. Small world, rural Ohio. Everyone 2 degrees removed from everyone else. She read the caption out loud without quite meaning to turn it into a scene, just muttering it in disbelief under her breath. But the room had gone quiet enough by then that everyone heard every word. The room went completely, totally silent. 25 guests, gas station chicken cooling on paper plates in front of each of them, staring at a photograph of the woman who was supposed to have made all of this happen, sitting on a beach 4,000 miles away with a cup of coffee and an expression, in the photo at least, of total peace. And that was the exact moment my Aunt Vivian set her coffee cup down on the side table, stood up slowly, the way people do when they've already decided something and want the whole room to notice the decision being made, and looked my father dead in the eye. "Walter," she said, loud enough to carry across the room. "Stop." He turned toward her, already reaching for some new variation on the caterer lie, some fresh excuse to slide into the silence. She didn't let him get there. "Stop lying to these people," she said. "There is no caterer. There never was one. Elena has cooked this meal every single year since she was 19 years old, and none of you have ever once asked her if she wanted to. You didn't lose a caterer today, Walter. You lost the person you've been treating like one for 12 years. My mother started crying at the sink, quietly, the kind of crying you do when you've known something for a long time and finally hear it said out loud by someone else, Grant said weakly. Aunt Viv, come on. But there was no real conviction behind it. Richard Marchetti looked at his daughter with an expression people later described to me as deeply, openly unimpressed, and asked, in front of the entire room, whether this was a normal pattern in the family Sienna was apparently considering marrying into. Nobody in that kitchen had an answer for him. Nobody even tried. I learned what happened next through a string of texts from Paige, who'd heard it secondhand through her cousin, who was friendly with someone connected to the Marchetti's church, and through a long, shaking voicemail my mother left me 2 days later, and through Vivian herself, who called me on December 27th and simply said, "I'm proud of you," before either of us said anything else. The Marchettis left within the hour, Donna citing a sudden headache that everyone in the room understood wasn't really a headache at all. Sienna stayed behind in the driveway with Grant for almost 40 minutes, and whatever was said out there, it ended with her getting into her own car and driving back to Cincinnati alone, without him. They didn't speak again for 3 weeks. Grant told me later, in one of the only genuinely honest conversations we've had since all of this happened, that Sienna had asked him a single question standing in that driveway. "If we get married, is this what you'll expect from me?" He said he didn't have an answer ready. He said not having one had scared him more than anything else that entire day, more than the silence in the kitchen, more than Vivian's voice cutting across the room. My father called me on December 26th. I let it go to voicemail. I listened to it the next morning on the beach, the ocean loud enough behind me that I nearly missed the important part. He didn't apologize. Not really. Not in the way I'd let myself hope for on the flight over. He said things had gotten out of hand, that he didn't realize how much I'd actually been carrying all these years, phrasing that quietly shifted the discovery onto him instead of the 12 years of behavior onto himself, where it actually belonged. My mother's voicemail was different. She cried through most of it, and near the very end she said the one thing I think I needed to hear more than any apology from either of them. "I found the notebook. Your grandmother's notebook. You left it open to the last page. I didn't know she felt that way either." I sat with that sentence for a long time on that beach before I called her back. There were financial complications that dragged well into February. My father briefly tried to claim the catering equipment as shared household property in an insurance inquiry about missing kitchen assets, a claim so laughably weak that Paige and I shut it down within a single day using purchase receipts and business tax filings going back 6 full years. It was never in real legal question, but it still took a certified letter from a lawyer friend of Paige's to get my father to formally drop the claim, and even after he dropped it, he told relatives for weeks afterward that I had stolen family property, a story that didn't survive contact with anyone who actually knew the plain facts. Vivian made sure of that. She became, almost by accident, the family's designated fact-checker that winter, correcting the narrative one phone call at a time whenever it drifted too far from what she'd personally watched unfold with her own eyes in that kitchen. The $31,000 I'd covered over the years never came back to me, and it never will. I've made a specific, limited kind of peace with that, the kind you make with a debt you already know will never be repaid. I don't bring it up anymore. I don't need to. It exists now as a fact everyone in that family quietly knows, and nobody quite wants to discuss out loud, which is, strangely, its own kind of acknowledgement acknowledgement, even if it isn't the one I originally wanted from any of them. There was a moment in late January, sitting alone in my apartment with my grandmother's notebook open on the kitchen table, when I finally let myself grieve the family I'd always believed I had. Not the family that actually existed, the one that had used me for over a decade, but the one I'd quietly imagined during all those years of cooking, the one where the effort meant something to somebody, where 144 unpaid meals eventually added up to being loved instead of simply being useful. That family had never really existed in the way I'd pictured it, and losing the illusion of it hurt worse, in some strange way, than anything my father had actually said or done that Christmas. I cried for one full evening. I let myself have it. Then I closed the notebook, put it somewhere it would be safe, and went back to my own life because it deserved to survive better than it had survived crammed in that attic for 20 years. Grant and I talk now, occasionally, mostly by text. He moved out of the basement in March, got a full-time job at a distribution center outside Dayton, and now pays $400 a month in rent to a friend's spare room, which isn't much, but it's more independence than he's had in 7 years combined. He told me once, in a rare unguarded moment over the phone, that watching Sienna's family walk out of that house was the first time he'd actually understood what the rest of us had been living inside for over a decade. I don't know if that understanding will stick with him long term. I've stopped needing it to, for my own sake and my own peace. I still cook. That part of me never left, and honestly, I wouldn't want it to. Paige and I booked our biggest contract yet this past spring, a 200-guest wedding out in Cincinnati, using every single piece of equipment that used to sit gathering dust in my parents' garage for years at a time. I cook now because I choose to, for clients who pay me exactly what the work is worth, or for friends who thank me before I've even finished setting the table. That distinction, choosing it instead of being quietly assumed into it, has changed the way food feels in my own hands. It tastes like mine again, in a way it hadn't in years. My parents still send holiday invitations. I go sometimes for a few hours, never with a chafing dish in the trunk anymore. Last Thanksgiving, I brought a store-bought pie and nothing else, and I sat at the table and watched my mother cook her own turkey for the first time in 12 years. Badly, a little dry around the edges, and I have never in my life enjoyed a holiday meal more than that one. My father still hasn't fully reckoned with what happened that Christmas. I don't think he ever fully will. Some people spend their whole lives standing just outside the edge of understanding what they cost the people who love them, and Walter, I suspect, will die there. Close, but never quite arriving at the full picture. I think about my grandmother's notebook more often than I expected to when I first found it. 187 meals, tallied carefully in blue ink, standing as quiet evidence that she had existed and given everything and been rarely, if ever, truly seen for it. I think about how close I came to becoming her exact continuation, meal number 188 in an unbroken line of women who fed a family that never once turned around and asked what they needed in return. I broke that line on a Tuesday in December, sitting on an attic floor with dust in my lungs and a dead woman's handwriting steady under my fingers. And then I finished breaking it 4 days later, 4,000 miles away, on a beach, with a cup of coffee going cold in my hand while my family finally, for the very first time in 12 years, had to figure out how to feed themselves. I don't regret those 12 years entirely. I learned to cook because of them, and that skill built the entire life I have now. The business, the independence, the version of myself I actually like. But I do regret how long it took me to understand that love, which only ever runs in one direction, isn't really love at all. It's labor with better lighting. Somewhere in Millbrook, Ohio, there's a rusted tin box back in that attic, and inside it my grandmother's ledger still ends at 187. Mine ends at 144. I like knowing the number stopped exactly where it did. I like knowing I was the one who stopped it, on my own terms, on my own timeline, without asking anyone's permission first. That's not a happy ending, not exactly. It's something quieter than that, and more honest. It's the sound of a door closing gently, on purpose, by the only person who ever actually had the right to close it.